Everything she owns now belongs to us.
After wife's funeral, husband and mistress expect to cash in. The bank revelation changes everything. Esteemed viewers, welcome to Luxurious True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more captivating luxury true stories. Let's get into the story. Naomi Benson was not the kind of billionaire the world expected. While others born into wealth carried an air of untouchable pride, Naomi moved through life with quiet discipline and thoughtful restraint. She was the only daughter of Harold Benson, a legendary financier whose investment strategies reshaped entire industries, and Margaret Benson, a former concert pianist who believed character mattered more than inheritance. Their estate overlooked a wide silver lake bordered by ancient oaks, yet Naomi preferred the glass-walled office downtown where decisions shaped the future of her company. By 32, she had multiplied the Benson fortune far beyond what even her father imagined, but success never hardened her. She still remembered the promise she made as a teenager: wealth should protect people, not isolate them. Her days began before sunrise. Naomi enjoyed the silence of early mornings, often jogging along the quiet waterfront before the city stirred awake. She had a habit of noticing small things others ignored: a struggling cafe owner, an exhausted employee, a charity lacking funds. Without seeking praise, she intervened. Many livelihoods quietly depended on her compassion. Yet for all her professional victories, her personal life remained carefully empty. Suitors appeared frequently, polished executives, aristocratic heirs, even celebrities, but their interest often felt directed toward her empire rather than her heart. Naomi wanted something unmanufactured, something steady. Love, to her, was not a merger, it was refuge. Despite her measured nature, Naomi possessed an adventurous curiosity. She collected rare books, played classical piano when she needed clarity, and occasionally escaped the city alone just to think. Her closest confidant, Eleanor Shaw, often joked that Naomi understood global markets better than she understood loneliness. Naomi would smile at that, but the truth lingered quietly within her. Boardrooms respected her. Headlines praised her. Competitors feared her precision. Still, when evening lights reflected across her penthouse windows, success sometimes felt like an echo in a room too large for one voice. What Naomi did not know was that her life stood at the edge of an irreversible turn. Soon, a chance encounter would introduce someone who seemed untouched by the glittering world she inhabited, someone who appeared grounded, sincere, and refreshingly ordinary. It would feel like fate rather than coincidence, and for the first time in years, Naomi would allow herself to believe that love had arrived without calculation. That belief, gentle as it was, would open a door she could never fully close. The rain began without warning, turning the evening streets into shimmering ribbons of reflected light. Naomi had just concluded a tense acquisition meeting when her driver suggested waiting for the storm to ease, but she preferred to step outside. Weather, she believed, revealed the city's true rhythm. As she crossed toward the quieter block, a sudden commotion drew her attention: raised voices, sharp with impatience. Near the entrance of a small architectural firm, a young man stood soaked, clutching a worn leather portfolio while a security guard blocked his path. His proposal had been rejected, loudly and without dignity, and now the firm's director was threatening to discard his designs altogether. Naomi paused beneath the shelter of the building across the street, observing. The man did not argue. He simply gathered his papers with controlled urgency, as though protecting something fragile. A gust of wind scattered several sketches into the rain, and before her assistant could react, Naomi stepped forward to help retrieve them. The drawings were precise, bold structures balanced with surprising elegance. "These are remarkable," she said quietly, handing them back. The man looked startled, embarrassed by the scene yet grateful. He introduced himself as David Collins, an architect struggling to secure his first major commission after months of rejection. There was a steadiness in his voice, a humility that felt untouched by pretense. They spoke briefly under the awning while rain hammered the pavement. David explained that investors favored established names. Talent alone rarely opened doors. Naomi listened more than she spoke, intrigued by the absence of entitlement in him. When her car pulled up, she hesitated, an instinct she rarely ignored. Instead of offering charity, she proposed something practical. Her development firm was reviewing designs for a cultural center. He could submit his work. David's expression shifted from guarded disappointment to cautious hope. He thanked her, not effusively, but with sincerity that lingered after she returned to the car. As the vehicle merged into traffic, Naomi found herself replaying the encounter. There had been no rehearsed charm, no attempt to impress her, just quiet resilience. For David, the meeting felt equally improbable. He watched the lights disappear, unaware that the woman who stopped in the rain was one of the most influential figures in the city. That night, he worked without sleep, refining his designs with renewed determination. Neither realized that what seemed like a fleeting moment would soon redraw the course of both their lives, one searching for authentic love, the other far more complicated than he appeared. David's proposal arrived at Benson Developments within days, printed on modest paper yet impossible to overlook. Naomi reviewed it late into the evening after her executive team had left. The design was daring, sweeping lines, natural light flowing through layered spaces, and a public garden built into the structure so the city itself felt invited inside. It reflected imagination rather than imitation. She approved it for consideration immediately, surprising several senior partners who favored safer choices. When David was invited to present, he entered the boardroom with visible restraint, unaware that the woman seated at the head of the table was the same stranger who had gathered his drawings in the rain. Recognition dawned slowly across his face, followed by disbelief. Naomi greeted him with professional calm, giving no sign that their meeting carried any special weight. David spoke with quiet conviction, describing not just a building but a place where people could gather, learn, and breathe. The room, accustomed to polished theatrics, found his simplicity disarming. By the time he finished, Naomi had already decided his firm would receive the contract. Afterward, she invited him for coffee to discuss revisions. What began as a working conversation drifted naturally into something easier. David spoke about growing up with very little, about teaching himself design through borrowed books, about refusing to surrender to circumstance. Naomi admired perseverance. It felt real. Their meetings became frequent. Sometimes they discussed materials and timelines, other times music, travel, or the strange loneliness that success and struggle could both create in different ways. Naomi found his presence grounding. With him, she did not feel like an empire, just a woman allowed to laugh without calculation. Yet beyond her circle, concern quietly gathered. Eleanor Shaw noticed the change first, Naomi checking her phone between meetings, leaving the office earlier than usual. When Naomi admitted she was seeing David, Eleanor's expression tightened with careful caution. Wealth, she reminded her gently, could blur intentions. Others echoed the sentiment, her legal advisor, even her father's oldest colleague, urging patience. Naomi listened but remained unmoved. She believed a suspicion could poison something good before it had the chance to grow. David had never asked for anything beyond opportunity. That alone felt rare in her world. One evening, as city lights shimmered below her balcony, she realized she was no longer guarding her heart as fiercely as before. Love, when it finally appears, seldom asks permission from logic. And so, with steady certainty, Naomi chose trust, unaware that the decision would one day stand at the center of everything that followed. The engagement unfolded quietly but sent loud ripples through Naomi's world. When David proposed, It was not beneath chandeliers or before cameras, but during a simple dinner overlooking the river where they had begun spending their rare free evenings. He spoke without flourish, saying life had always felt uncertain until her presence gave it direction. Naomi accepted without hesitation. For the first time, her future did not look like a sequence of strategic decisions, it looked shared. News traveled quickly once the announcement became public, igniting fascination across business circles. Some admired the romance. Others questioned the imbalance between a self-made billionaire and a man who had only recently stepped into stability. Their wedding reflected Naomi's preference for elegance rather than spectacle. A private garden ceremony replaced the grand cathedral many expected. White orchids lined the pathways, and a string quartet carried soft melodies through the summer air. David appeared composed, though inwardly he felt the weight of countless observing eyes measuring whether he belonged. Naomi, calm and radiant, seemed untouched by judgment. When they exchanged vows, her voice held quiet certainty. His carried emotion convincing enough to silence most doubts. By evening, headlines praised the union as proof that love could transcend class. Yet beneath David's gratitude stirred something new, an awareness of doors opening effortlessly simply because he now stood beside her. Life after the wedding shifted swiftly. David moved into Naomi's expansive penthouse where sunrise spilled through towering windows. He traded cramped apartments for tailored suites, learned the rhythm of high-profile dinners, and discovered how easily influence bent circumstances. Naomi never flaunted her wealth, but its reach was undeniable. She introduced him to philanthropic boards, investors, and cultural leaders, trusting he would grow comfortable in time. David adapted faster than anyone predicted. He listened carefully, spoke less, and observed how power functioned. With each passing week, admiration from others fed a quiet hunger he struggled to name, not merely to share Naomi's world, but to command a portion of it. Naomi noticed his transformation yet interpreted it as confidence blooming. She supported his ambitions, even funding the expansion of his architectural practice so he could build under his own name. Gratitude defined his words, but ambition increasingly shaped his thoughts. At night, when the city dimmed and silence returned, Naomi often felt a peaceful completeness she had never known before. Marriage, she believed, had anchored her. What she could not see was the subtle shift occurring beside her, the moment when appreciation begins to blur into entitlement, and when stepping into someone else's world quietly awakens the desire to possess it. Success settled around David with surprising ease, yet comfort did not quiet him, it sharpened his awareness of what remained beyond reach. At corporate galas he stood beside Naomi while executives deferred to her judgment without hesitation. Conversations paused when she spoke. Agreements formed with a single nod. Though he smiled through these evenings, a private comparison took root. He was introduced as Naomi Benson's husband, never simply David Collins. The distinction, subtle but constant, stirred a restlessness he could not fully explain. Naomi, meanwhile, moved through their marriage with steady devotion. She encouraged his projects, celebrated his growing firm, and trusted him with increasing responsibility inside her development network. When she surprised him by arranging financing for his largest design yet, a waterfront residential complex, David accepted with warmth that appeared genuine. Yet later, reviewing the contracts alone, he noticed how every advantage traced back to her influence. Gratitude slowly tangled with pride. He began telling himself he deserved such opportunities, that his talent, not Naomi, justified the elevation. The shift showed in small ways first. David grew impatient with delays, dismissive toward colleagues who reminded him of his former struggles. He upgraded his wardrobe again, chose more exclusive clubs, and cultivated friendships with people who respected status above sincerity. Naomi observed the changes, but interpreted them as natural adjustments to a larger life. Love, she believed, meant allowing someone space to evolve. When he became quieter at home, she assumed work weighed on him and responded with gentleness rather than questions. Yet beneath the polished surface, dissatisfaction widened. David no longer feared returning to poverty. Instead, he feared remaining secondary. Watching Naomi command rooms awakened a dangerous thought. What would it feel like if the power were his? The idea lingered longer each time it surfaced, until admiration began giving way to envy. And envy, once welcomed, rarely remains harmless. Jane Taylor entered David's life on an autumn evening lit by crystal chandeliers and low orchestral music. The charity auction Naomi hosted each year drew influential guests from every sector, but Jane did not arrive as a socialite. She came as a senior strategy consultant representing a private investment group interested in future partnerships with Benson Developments. Tall, poised, and observant, Jane possessed the rare ability to study a room within seconds and understand exactly where influence lived. When she was introduced to David, her handshake was confident, her smile measured, the kind that suggested both intelligence and intention. Their first conversation was effortless. Jane spoke with admiration about his architectural work, referencing details few outside the industry would notice. David felt seen in a way that startled him. Unlike others who approached him through Naomi, Jane addressed him directly, as though his identity required no attachment. Before the evening ended, she remarked casually that living in the shadow of greatness could either strengthen a person or quietly erase them. The comment lingered with him long after the event ended. It was not sympathy she offered, it was recognition. Professional meetings followed. Jane's firm proposed collaborating on a series of luxury developments, and David became the primary liaison. Discussions stretched into private lunches where conversation drifted from business into personal territory. Jane revealed fragments of her own story, a childhood shaped by instability, years spent climbing competitive corporate ladders, and a belief that security belonged only to those bold enough to claim it. She admired ambition without apology. David found her perspective both unsettling and magnetic. What began as intellectual connection soon warmed into something more charged, lingering glances, conversations that felt too personal for colleagues, silences filled with unspoken curiosity. Jane never rushed the shift. She understood patience. One evening, as they overlooked the city from a quiet rooftop restaurant, she asked a question that sounded simple yet carried weight. Have you ever wondered what your life would look like if it were entirely yours? David did not answer immediately, but the thought followed him home. Naomi remained unaware, trusting the harmony of the life they had built. She continued planning future expansions, speaking often about legacy and the years ahead. Meanwhile, a new presence had begun weaving itself quietly into David's world, perceptive, persuasive, and unafraid to awaken desires he had never dared examine. Some arrivals change nothing. Others alter direction so gradually that the turning point is only recognized when it is far too late to step back. Secrecy did not arrive dramatically. It slipped into David's routine with careful subtlety. What began as extended meetings with Jane soon required explanations, additional site visits, investor dinners, strategy sessions that ran late into the night. Naomi rarely questioned him. Trust had always been the quiet foundation of their marriage, and she believed his suspicion corroded love faster than truth ever could. When David returned home past midnight, she often left a lamp glowing in the living room, a silent gesture of care that stirred a brief, inconvenient guilt he learned to suppress. With Jane, however, David felt a growing sense of expansion. She challenged him openly, often suggesting he underestimated his own capability. During one private lunch, she observed how frequently his achievements were attributed to Naomi's influence. People respect proximity to power, she said calmly, but they rarely respect dependence. The statement settled deeply. Jane never directly criticized Naomi. Instead, she framed her thoughts around independence, control, and the freedom that came with possessing wealth rather than sharing it. Each conversation nudged David further from gratitude toward quiet resentment. Their relationship crossed its invisible boundary on a winter evening after a successful contract signing. Celebration turned personal, and personal became irreversible. From then on, David existed in two emotional climates, the stability of home and the charged unpredictability Jane offered. Strangely, he convinced himself he was not betraying Naomi, but simply discovering the version of himself that had long been constrained. Rationalizations came easily once desire aligned with ambition. Naomi noticed only fragments, his distracted gaze, conversations that trailed off, the way his phone rarely left his side. Yet whenever concern surfaced, David answered with practiced warmth, redirecting her attention toward shared plans, vacations, future properties, philanthropic projects they would oversee together. She chose belief, unaware that the man she loved was slowly becoming someone divided. Meanwhile, Jane watched the transformation with patient precision. She understood that people rarely abandon comfort unless shown a vision more intoxicating than what they already possess. So she painted pictures of influence without limitation, of a life directed entirely by their choices. David listened, and with every passing week, the distance between his vows and his desires widened into something far more dangerous than either of them yet named. The suggestion surfaced so gently that David almost mistook it for a passing thought. He and Jane sat in a quiet corner of an exclusive lounge, the city glowing beneath wide windows while muted jazz softened the air. Their latest development deal had collapsed after Naomi redirected company funds toward a humanitarian housing project, a decision widely praised but privately frustrating to investors seeking faster profit. Jane traced the rim of her glass thoughtfully before speaking. "It's extraordinary," she said, "how one person's priorities can determine the limits of everyone else's future." David understood the implication immediately, though neither spoke Naomi's name. He defended his wife at first, describing her generosity as strength rather than weakness. Jane listened without interruption, then asked a question that lingered longer than any argument. "But where does that leave your vision?" She spoke of opportunity slipping away, of how fortunes were often guided by those bold enough to shape them. Her tone carried no urgency, only calm logic. By the time the evening ended, David felt less defensive and more contemplative, as though a door had quietly appeared where no wall had existed before. Days later, the idea returned with sharper edges. Reviewing financial structures alongside Jane, David realized how much of Naomi's empire remained under her singular authority. Even in marriage, her safeguards ensured stability. "Security is admirable," Jane remarked, "but it also means nothing moves without her consent." She paused before adding, almost lightly, "Imagine what could be built if those constraints disappeared." The words were not a command, nor even a clear proposal, just possibility, suspended in the space between them. David did not answer. Yet that night, sleep avoided him. For the first time, he examined his life not as shared partnership, but as a hierarchy. He pictured years unfolding with Naomi always at the center of decisions, her principles guiding outcomes he might not choose himself. The thought unsettled him more than it should have. Somewhere beneath loyalty, ambition stirred with unfamiliar intensity. Jane sensed the shift and did nothing to rush it. She understood that the most powerful ideas were the ones people believed they discovered alone. As weeks passed, her comments grew slightly less abstract, her hypotheticals more defined. Not once did she demand action. She merely illuminated what life might look like if circumstances were different. By the time David recognized how far his thoughts had drifted, the idea no longer felt shocking. It felt inevitable, a silent, dangerous conclusion forming without needing to be spoken aloud. Winter deepened, and with it came a quiet emotional distance inside the penthouse Naomi once filled with warmth. She noticed David studying her more often, not with affection, but with a strange calculation she could not interpret. When she asked if something troubled him, he answered smoothly, blaming expanding projects and investor pressure. Naomi responded the only way she knew how, with support. She suggested he take more authority within upcoming developments, even offering partial oversight on a new international venture. To her, empowerment was love in action. To David, it began to feel like proximity to something he wanted entirely. Meanwhile, Jane shifted from suggestion to structure. She spoke less in hypotheticals and more about timing, risk, and consequence, always framed carefully within conversations about how fragile life could be. Fortunes change overnight, she remarked during one meeting, sliding a tablet toward him that displayed complex inheritance frameworks commonly used by the ultra-wealthy. David scanned the information slowly. Naomi's financial world was layered with protections, yet like any system, it relied on circumstances remaining unchanged. Jane never instructed him. She simply highlighted how unpredictable events often reshaped ownership far faster than negotiation ever could. David resisted the direction of his own thoughts at first. He reminded himself of Naomi's loyalty, the years she had invested in him, the trust she never questioned. But ambition, once awakened, rarely retreats quietly. He began noticing details he once ignored, her travel routines, her preference for privacy during certain retreats, the way she insisted on handling sensitive matters personally rather than delegating them. None of it meant anything alone. Together, however, the observations formed patterns. At home, Naomi planned a short countryside escape, hoping distance from the city would give them rest. She imagined long walks, unhurried dinners, and conversations free from interruption. David agreed readily, his calm acceptance masking the storm gathering beneath it. When she spoke about the future, foundations they would expand, communities they would help, he listened with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. One evening, as snow fell in slow silence beyond the windows, David stood awake long after Naomi slept. The life beside him was stable, generous, and secure. Yet the dangerous idea that had once seemed impossible now felt disturbingly practical. Somewhere along the line, the boundary between imagining and considering had vanished. And in that quiet hour, without a single word spoken, the plot ceased to be theoretical. The countryside welcomed them with deceptive calm. Naomi chose the estate for its privacy, rolling hills, frozen lakes reflecting pale sunlight, and air untouched by the urgency of the city. She seemed lighter there, trading tailored suits for soft coats, letting her hair fall freely as they walked narrow paths lined with sleeping trees. For a moment, it felt like the early days of their marriage again. She spoke about slowing down, about how success meant little if life passed too quickly to enjoy it. David listened attentively, offering nods at the right moments, his composure so complete that nothing betrayed the finality forming inside him. On their third evening, snow began falling again, thicker than before, muting the world into near silence. Naomi suggested staying in rather than visiting the nearby village. They dined beside a low fire while wind pressed gently against the tall windows. Later, she mentioned feeling slightly unwell, a sudden dizziness she dismissed with a tired smile. David reacted with convincing concern, guiding her to rest and insisting he would call for medical advice if needed. But as the night stretched forward, her discomfort worsened rapidly, transforming from mild unease into something far more alarming. Emergency services were summoned, their distant sirens breaking the stillness too late to alter what had already begun unfolding. By the time help arrived, the estate no longer felt peaceful. It felt suspended in disbelief. Naomi, usually composed even under pressure, struggled to remain conscious. David stayed close, his expression carefully arranged between fear and shock. When the paramedics worked urgently, he stepped aside just enough to watch without interference. Morning carried the news no one expected. Naomi Benson, visionary, leader, and one of the most respected figures in modern finance, was gone. The official explanation pointed toward a sudden, severe medical event, rare and devastating in its speed. Tributes flooded every network within hours. Markets paused in respect. Employees gathered in silent clusters outside company headquarters, many unable to comprehend the future without her steady presence. David delivered his grief flawlessly. Cameras captured a widower hollowed by loss, his voice unsteady as he thanked the public for their compassion. Few questioned what they saw. Sorrow has a way of discouraging scrutiny. Yet beneath the performance lay an unsettling quiet, not relief, not triumph, but the fragile awareness that life had just crossed an irreversible threshold. Far away from the flashing headlines and whispered condolences, sealed documents waited patiently within institutions Naomi trusted. Systems she had constructed with precision remained untouched, ready to respond to circumstances no one yet fully understood. The world believed the story had ended with tragedy. In truth, something far more consequential was only beginning. The funeral drew leaders, innovators, and thousands whose lives Naomi had quietly changed. White lilies surrounded the cathedral, and the air carried a heavy stillness that made every footstep sound louder than it should. David stood at the front dressed in controlled sorrow, accepting condolences with lowered eyes. Many admired his composure, calling it strength. Only Eleanor Shaw noticed how quickly his grief seemed to settle whenever attention shifted away. Jane remained unseen by most, watching from a distance behind dark glasses. Their communication had been cautious since Naomi's death, but now a shared anticipation replaced secrecy. The empire Naomi left behind was vast: companies, properties, investments layered across continents. To the public, David appeared the natural successor, the grieving husband destined to carry her legacy forward. Days after the burial, David and Jane finally met in private. The mood was not celebratory but charged with the expectation. Years of patience, calculation, and restraint seemed ready to yield reward. All that remained was the formal transfer of wealth. With quiet confidence, they scheduled a meeting at Naomi's primary private bank, certain the future was about to open exactly as they had imagined. The private bank occupied the top floors of a steel tower, its silence almost ceremonial. David arrived in a tailored black coat, Jane beside him, both carrying the quiet certainty that this meeting marked the beginning of their new life. They were led into a polished conference room where a senior director and 2 legal officers waited, their expressions professional yet unusually reserved. After brief condolences, a sealed portfolio was placed on the table. The director explained that Naomi had structured her holdings under a fortified estate plan updated shortly before her death. David listened calmly at first, expecting routine formalities. Instead, the next sentence shifted the air completely. Naomi's wealth had not transferred to him. Most of her fortune had been moved into an irrevocable trust years earlier. Control would activate only under strict ethical reviews and independent oversight. David was granted a modest personal provision, enough for comfort but nowhere near authority. Even more startling, leadership of Benson developments would temporarily pass to an appointed executor Naomi had selected in confidence. Jane's composure fractured first. David remained still, but the color drained from his face as document after document confirmed the same reality. Naomi had anticipated risk. Her empire was protected from sudden inheritance, manipulation, or marital claim. The final page carried a short handwritten line from Naomi: "True legacy must outlive intention." For the first time since her death, David felt something unfamiliar, not grief, but the cold shock of realizing the future he expected had never been his to claim. David left the bank in silence, the city noise suddenly harsh against his thoughts. Nothing had unfolded as planned. Naomi, whom he once considered trusting to a fault, had quietly built barriers impossible to bypass. Every pathway to immediate control had been sealed behind legal precision. Even access to certain properties now required board approval. Sitting in the car, David reread the summary again and again, searching for a weakness that was not there. Naomi had not merely prepared for death, she had prepared for betrayal without ever naming it. Jane reacted differently. Shock gave way to sharp analysis. By evening, she was already mapping possibilities, contesting the trust, influencing board members, identifying clauses that might be challenged over time. Yet each strategy met the same obstacle: Naomi's executor. The appointment had been confidential, activated only upon her passing. Whoever this person was held temporary authority over major decisions until a permanent structure took shape. "Find the executor," Jane said firmly. "Power always sits somewhere." The following morning delivered another surprise. Company leadership received notice that the executor would address senior staff within days. Markets responded with cautious stability, a sign investors trusted Naomi's unseen preparation. Watching the announcement replay across financial networks, David felt a tightening pressure he could not control. Naomi was gone, yet her influence moved with unsettling precision, as if her hand still guided the empire from somewhere just beyond reach. The headquarters buzzed with restrained anxiety as executives gathered in the glass conference hall. Conversations stayed low, cautious, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile order Naomi had left behind. David entered with measured confidence, expecting deference despite the previous day's shock. Instead, he noticed something unfamiliar: distance. People greeted him politely, yet their eyes carried a quiet evaluation that had not existed before. Then the executor arrived. Eleanor Shaw stepped forward. For a brief second, the room seemed to lose sound. Naomi's closest confidant, the woman who understood the company almost as deeply as its founder, now held interim authority. Eleanor spoke calmly, outlining Naomi's continuity plan. Leadership would remain stable, major assets untouched, and an internal review would ensure every recent decision aligned with Naomi's long-term vision. Her tone was steady but carried an undercurrent of watchfulness that made David unexpectedly uneasy. Later that afternoon, a compliance team requested access to several project files David had recently supervised. The explanation was procedural, part of Naomi's automatic audit framework triggered after her death. Still, the request felt pointed. When David mentioned it to Jane, her expression hardened. "Audits mean patterns," she said quietly. "And patterns invite questions." For the first time since the bank meeting, a shared realization settled between them: Naomi's protection plan was not passive. It was actively beginning to look closer. 2 days later, Eleanor requested a private meeting with David. Her office, once a place of easy conversation, now felt formal and guarded. She spoke with professional calm, explaining that Naomi had activated multiple safeguards designed to preserve transparency across all operations. Among them was a digital archive that recorded sensitive approvals, travel logs, and executive authorizations. "Naomi believed clarity prevents confusion," Eleanor said, watching him carefully. David nodded, masking the quick pulse rising in his throat. That same afternoon, another name began circulating quietly within the company: Marcus Reed, a forensic financial specialist Naomi had retained months earlier under a long-term consultancy. Few had noticed his work, because it blended seamlessly into routine risk assessments. Now his role expanded. Marcus approached reviews with patient precision, cross-checking timelines and expenditures without accusation, yet nothing escaped his attention. To most employees it felt like diligence. To David, it felt uncomfortably close to scrutiny. When David relayed the development to Jane, she remained composed but unusually silent for a moment. "Preparation like this isn't random," she finally said. She expected disruption. The thought unsettled them both. Naomi had never confronted him, never hinted at distrust, yet the structures she left behind suggested remarkable foresight. That night, as David stared across the dark skyline, a troubling awareness settled in. Whatever Naomi suspected while alive, she had ensured the truth would not remain buried for long. The reviews intensified quietly but steadily. Emails requesting clarification appeared almost daily, each polite yet precise. Marcus Reed's team examined scheduling overlaps, authorization trails, and communication gaps with clinical neutrality. No accusations surfaced, yet the growing attention pressed heavily on David's composure. He began arriving earlier at the office, leaving later, determined to appear cooperative. Still, the sense of being observed followed him everywhere, in elevators, across conference tables, even within casual greetings that now felt slightly measured. Jane, once unshakably confident, started urging caution in every interaction. Meetings between them became shorter, their conversations sharper. She warned him against emotional reactions, reminding him that control often depended on patience. But strange change is people. Small disagreements surfaced, whether they had moved too quickly, whether certain decisions had drawn unnecessary notice. Trust, once fueled by shared ambition, now competed with quiet self-preservation. Sleep abandoned David almost entirely. He replayed past weeks searching for overlooked details, moments that might appear suspicious when viewed through an investigator's lens. One evening he caught his reflection in the dark window of his study and barely recognized the tension carved into his expression. The life he expected to command now felt unstable, as though the ground beneath it shifted without warning. And for the first time, a question emerged that ambition had long drowned out, not whether the plan would succeed, but whether it had already begun unraveling. Marcus Reed requested another formal review, this time focusing on the countryside trip, timelines, medical response intervals, and communication records from that night. The questions were methodical, delivered without emotion, yet each one narrowed the space around David. Eleanor attended silently, taking occasional notes, her expression impossible to read. When the session ended, Marcus simply thanked David for his cooperation, but the absence of reassurance spoke louder than any accusation. Outside the building, David immediately called Jane. His voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. She advised restraint, reminding him that investigations often relied on pressure to provoke mistakes. "Stay consistent," she said. "Consistency looks like truth." Yet even she could not ignore the pattern forming. Naomi's systems were aligning with unsettling precision, drawing attention closer to the very period they hoped would remain unquestioned. Later that evening, a notification spread quietly through executive channels. Medical specialists had been asked to re-examine Naomi's sudden passing as part of a standard high-profile review. The wording was careful, procedural, but its implication was unmistakable. What had once been accepted as tragic misfortune was now being looked at again. Standing alone in the dim light of his living room, David felt the walls of certainty collapse inward. For the first time, escape no longer seemed like a strategy. It seemed like an impossibility. The reassessment concluded faster than anyone expected. Independent specialists identified irregular medical indicators that did not fully align with the natural event. Authorities were notified, and what began as an internal review shifted into a formal investigation. The announcement remained discreet, but within executive circles the meaning was clear. Naomi's death was no longer being treated as unquestioned tragedy. Jane's composure finally cracked. She urged David to remain calm, yet her own urgency betrayed rising fear. Their conversations lost the confidence they once carried, replaced by cautious wording and long silences. Each began wondering what the other might reveal under pressure. The partnership that once felt unbreakable now trembled under the weight of consequence. Days later, investigators presented a timeline supported by digital records, travel data, and verified communications. The pattern pointed toward deliberate interference rather than chance. Faced with converging evidence, the illusion collapsed. The truth surfaced not in dramatic confrontation, but through undeniable clarity. The careful life Naomi built had anticipated risk, and even in absence, her foresight guided the path to accountability. The legal process moved with steady authority. Once the findings became official, David was removed from all executive affiliations connected to Naomi's companies. Public statements remained measured, emphasizing commitment to integrity rather than scandal, yet the impact was unmistakable. Investors expressed support for the safeguards Naomi had established, praising the resilience of a system designed to withstand even the most personal disruption. Jane attempted distance at first, presenting herself as professionally connected but uninvolved. However, records told their own story: meetings, coordinated decisions, and communications that revealed alignment far deeper than coincidence. Under mounting pressure, their alliance fractured completely. Self-preservation replaced loyalty, and the future they once imagined dissolved into separate battles neither could control. For those who had admired Naomi, the outcome carried a quiet sorrow but also relief. Her foresight had done more than protect wealth. It had protected the values she built her empire upon. Eleanor ensured company operations continued without spectacle, reinforcing the culture Naomi believed should outlive any single leader. Justice, when it finally settled, did not arrive with noise, only the firm restoration of order where betrayal once tried to take root. Months later, the Benson Foundation announced its largest initiative yet: housing, education grants, and medical research funded through the very trust David once expected to command. Naomi's handwritten principle guided every project: wealth should secure futures, not merely accumulate. Communities benefited, innovation resumed, and her name became associated not with tragedy, but with enduring impact. Eleanor often reflected on her friend's remarkable clarity. Naomi had understood something many overlooked: legacy is strongest when it cannot be redirected by sudden ambition. By placing her empire in careful stewardship, she ensured that compassion, not opportunism, would shape what came next. The company stabilized, employees regained confidence, and new leadership emerged from within the culture Naomi had cultivated. On a quiet morning, sunlight filled the same waterfront path Naomi once walked before the city awakened. Life had moved forward, yet her influence remained woven into its rhythm. Though betrayal had attempted to rewrite her story, foresight granted her the final word. What endured was not the scheme against her, but the new beginnings she set in motion, proof that true vision continues guiding the world long after its creator is gone. As this story comes to an end, remember that behind every luxury lies a truth few ever see. If this story moved you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until the next unforgettable true story, stay inspired and stay curious.